Our season continues instead of Admiral Coburn's flagship. Anakin and Natabre were watching their students train again. Since their first encounter with the Ghost, there was a bit of tension in the air. Despite the agreed-upon agreement between Skywalker and Coburn, there was still something that hadn't yet been addressed between him and his other general. They were leaders, and they were co-leading this group of soldiers. The erratic act on Thifera cost lives, and it almost cost all of their own lives. Anakin knew he messed up, but he didn't really know how to address it. Despite the connection they had developed with each other, this was different. It was an action that almost cost all their lives. The two of them hadn't had a clear line of communication since the incident. Today was the first full day of training for Ahsoka and Zala. Due to their age and their size, the effects of the Force drain had a much more significant effect on them. Anakin stood next to Natabre as they watched their students practicing below in the training room. Anakin reached forward and turned off the microphone. He tilted his head towards Natabre and told her that they needed to talk. She looked over with her eyes only and crossed her arms, agreeing that they did need to talk. He expressed that his actions were faulty and that the chase after victory wasn't exactly the Jedi thing to do. But more importantly, it wasn't the most appropriate thing for a leader to do, and he apologized. Natabre looked at him silently for a couple of moments. Truthfully, this apology should have come days beforehand. Anakin knew it, and he could see it on her face. She turned and faced him fully, and she closed her eyes and let out a deep breath. She called him by his name and told him that they were to work as a team. To be generals in a war, they had to be as one. It wouldn't be something they could do all the time because that was impossible, but they needed to work with each other. Natabre said that she accepted the apology, but said that it would mean more if he apologized to Zala and Ahsoka rather than herself. They could communicate in a different way than the students could to them. Anakin agreed, and he told her that he would. He stepped back and silence filled the air again. Everything felt like there was a bit of peace, but a slight awkwardness. Natabre was focused on her student's performance, but Anakin wasn't. He asked if everything was okay between them, and she said it was. Anakin felt like something was off, and she looked at him and told him that nothing was wrong, reminding him to calm his nerves. She placed her hand on the back of his shoulder and reminded him of the seas of Ahch-To. Listened to them inside of his head, and then he could find his peace. She wasn't angry at him. She just wanted him to remember that his actions had consequences, not just for himself. This was no longer Tython. They weren't on a secret mission anymore. They were leading an army, and they had students to take care of too. Anakin thanked her and she smiled before telling him that it was time for the Padawans to finish. There was another briefing coming in. Anakin told Natabre to head to the bridge. He'd finish up the session for the students. He could also leave his apology for them. Natabre looked at him for a short moment and with a quick nod, walked out the room towards the bridge. Anakin would go down to the bottom of the training arena, congratulate the students on their project, and then apologize to them. They were both accepting of the apology, and then they were told to come to the bridge or do whatever they wanted. Ahsoka and Zala looked at each other and started giggling. Anakin asked what was so funny. They shook their heads and said nothing. He rolled his eyes and walked away. They prepared for a counterattack on Master Sky Guy. They used the Force and taped a piece of paper to his back. On it said the words "kick me." It was even funnier to them when he turned around and started walking away. Sure, the Force could be used for serenity and all, but it could also be good for joking every so often. As Anakin walked through the halls, Commander Cody came up to him and asked him if he was walking around with a sign on his back. Anakin turned with confusion and he couldn't reach it, so Cody grabbed it for him. Anakin found it amusing and told Cody that he'd have to get them back. Cody kinda just nodded his head. To the books, Cody didn't really get all the horsing around and joking around that Skywalker and Tano did. Commander Issaka, who was still really quiet when she first came around on board, seemed to be influenced by Ahsoka and Anakin. Natabre wasn't as much, but her student definitely fell into the trap. It was hard not to. Ahsoka and Anakin had extremely contagious personalities, so for someone as young as Zala, she just fell in line. Natabre didn't mind. She was happy to see Zala was coming out of her shell, though part of Natabre feared for her student. Aside from the massacre at the temple, that shell was protecting something that she hadn't explained to anyone, not since arriving on Ahch-To or having been assigned to Morden. Regardless, Skywalker and Cody walked into the room and Anakin stood next to Natabre, as the Admiral told them the communication was coming in. The first hologram that popped up was Captain Tarkin, then Windu, Plo Koon, Kit Fisto, Shakti, Operencesis, and next to him was Jocasta Nu. The session began as others who weren't displayed on the forefront of the hologram were able to listen in and watch. Everyone got to listen, not everyone got to speak. It was a simple hierarchy. Captain Tarkin plugged in a chip identifying what had been located on the Endor system, along with the information collected by former Sith Sola Gray. She was currently being transported back to an inner world for the Republic War effort. Nowhere close to Ahch-To, but somewhere where they could keep a close eye on her. According to the information she displayed, and the correct artifacts that had been collected by Delta Squad on the Forest Moon, the information they had was laid out before them as such. The information from Biss went to Syrah, Bakura, and Endor. All three artifacts led to each other, and from there they went outwards. It was a path through Lewek, where they believed the Starforge was located. As Tarkin pointed out the analysis of the three items collected from the three planets on the outer edge of the galaxy, they each had one piece of the puzzle. The triangular device was the location of all three. When they were all collected, it shined a beacon that led to Lewek. The ring under the hand could be plugged into the bottom of the triangle, which allowed it to show the beacon, which was more or less a small star map of this side of the galaxy, showing off planets like Cordia, Ratatak, and so forth. Though as Revan likely knew, the ring didn't work without the third artifact. Malak likely didn't want to tamper with it until his master got access to the artifact. The bone, on the other hand, had a transcribing on it that was really primitive, but that was intentional. Whoever inscribed it on the bone was able to communicate with the Ewoks, which is why it was in their language. Anyways, the bone had a star map inscribed on the side of it, which pointed at the same location as the others. It was just, as it seems, a means to get to the Starforge if everything else failed. Obviously, the people who did it didn't want someone unworthy to go to the Starforge, and if someone could be trusted enough for the Ewoks, then perhaps they would be trustworthy enough to access the weapon. Also, it was as if one needed all three artifacts to use the Wayfinder, or they needed to befriend the Ewoks. How peculiar. Mace asked if they would be rerouting all fleets to the area of Lewek. Tarkin thought it'd be a good idea. However, due to the mission on Endor turning into an attack, he believed the Sith Empire was fully aware of the discoveries, though if they knew how to get there, that was a different story. Plo Koon suggested that all three major fleets relocate out there to create a diversion. Skywalker's fleet wasn't massive, but it was one of the larger ones in the area. Due to no one knowing about the failure at Thifera, Windu was dispatching Skywalker's fleet to Lewek. His mission was to locate the Starforge and capture it. Windu told him that he and his forces were currently en route to Cordia, so if they could successfully rout the enemy there, they'd be one step closer to making a push for Lewek. Anakin reaffirmed his directive, and it was confirmed. Plo told him that he would be moving his fleet out there soon, though one thing that they had to worry about was plugging in holes where these fleets were leaving, especially the Malastare one. Even Peel came over Tarkin's end and told the Council that his fleet would reroute from Bespin and make its way to Malastare. Shocked, he told the Council that there were several units of clone troopers coming off of Camino. They'd very easily be able to plug in those holes. Kit Fisto spoke up, and he told Skywalker that he'd be taking a small fleet out towards the exterior of the known galaxy, and he could likely link up with either him or Master Windu in the area. Jocasta Nu was rather disappointed as she came over the communications device and told the Council that despite the artifacts that were found by Delta Squad on the Forest Moon, her and her team finally uncovered the secrets in the weapon Duchess Satine gave the Master blow. She expressed that it was written in two different dialects of the Mandalorian ancient languages, mixed with some other things that no one had spoken since before the age of the Old Republic. She continued and said that on the back there was a map to the apparent weapon that could be located on Malachor. The feed for a split second cut off the hologram and then it restarted. Jocasta didn't even notice as she was twisting the sword around in her hands when it happened. She said that while Tarkin's descriptions of the map heading to Lewek were correct, there was another planet called Lanera. Windu cut her off and told her to not speak anymore. She was taken aback. Windu told them to cut all communications off immediately, and so the Council quickly did, though Windu was the last one to leave the call. He spoke to what seemed to be himself, and he told the Sith that they were listening, that he and his allies would be the architects of their destruction. If it was a war they wanted, then it was a war they would lose, just as they had every single war beforehand. He ended the transmission and turned to his fleet admiral and told them they needed to prepare for anything. Anakin turned to Natabre, and she said that Sith may have been listening. She told Anakin they needed to make an action. He asked what she was thinking, and she smiled, telling him that he already knew before she said it. He agreed. He knew. Natabre turned around and told Admiral Coburn to reroute the fleet for Lewek, and prepare for what would likely be their greatest test of the war. He concurred, and turned around immediately giving the fleet orders. They could all feel the ship twist as the fleet turned the direction they needed to be in and launched into hyperspace. Outside the Endor system, Lord Revan looked at the Council of Sith and expressed despite his setbacks, he didn't have any failure to show for him. Exar Kun told him to silence himself. His insolence was nothing but a perpetual state of annoyance. Revan looked with anger in his eyes at Exar over the hologram, though it was probably for the best that he had a mask on, because Exar would have really hated the expression on his face. The Sith were given the directive to launch their fleets away from the core worlds and make a move to the unknown regions, though Exar made it extremely clear where he would be going. When the call ended, Revan looked at Malak with disdain, and he asked if they were going to be able to use the tracker to find where Windu's fleet was heading. Malak nodded his head. Despite the belief that the commandos were able to get off the Forest Moon free, the fighters that chased them through the Force weren't trying to damage them, they were just trying to set the trap. Revan had his chance to blindside Tarkin's fleet, but he knew that wouldn't get him any results that he wanted. Revan could easily destroy a fleet, but destroying a fleet and securing artifacts was a different story. His expertise in strategy allowed him to concoct the perfect plan, one that would destroy the Republic war effort, though he truthfully couldn't be too boastful about it, because his plan almost didn't work. The tracker attached to the Republic shuttle had a communication interception device on it. It was a prototype, so there was no guarantee that it would work. It's why they entered the call at such a late time, and it's exactly why the Republic was able to see that they entered the call. It just surprised the Jedi, and in the time they were reacting to it, Jocasta Nu happened to not notice. It was also how Revan was able to track the longest communication device, which was from Windu. They didn't have time to track the other fleets aside from the one previously mentioned, so thanks to the tracker, Revan and the Sith knew where the Jedi were potentially going. Obviously the prize was at Luwak, apparently, but if all else failed, then perhaps they'd find more luck with the Malachor plan. Revan ordered Malak to prepare the fleet to jump to hyperspace. The fleet did, and then Malak turned to Revan and asked what was on his mind. The Sith Lord turned to his apprentice and told him that it was the beginning of the end. He wasn't sure what it was, but something was at play. He snapped out of his melodramatic spiel about what he was feeling through the Force, or whatever trickery this was, and asked Malak if he knew which star system Windu would be going to. Malak pointed to the three that were potential targets, but they were making their way for the most likely. There was a 72.4% chance that he would end up there, or at least according to the algorithm. Instead of Admiral Coburn's fleet and flagship, Anakin was sitting inside of his room. He was reflecting and attempting a meditation. The words Natabre said to him inside of the training facility sat inside of his mind, and he figured that he needed to have a clear conscience before they got to the planet. He had no reason to assume they would come across any enemy forces. While the transmission was cut, he truthfully believed Mace was being paranoid. This wasn't the first time a communication was interrupted. Typically, one assumed it was a pack of Purrgil migrating or some other space anomaly happening. Anakin was focused and he was sitting on his mat with his legs crossed under him. His back was curved until he straightened up his posture. He took a deep breath, and as he breathed out, his arms fell flat into his legs. He closed his eyes and tightened them, thinking back on the past and coming to terms with it so he could be prepared in the present. He learned these lessons, but he wanted to make sure there was nothing that would flare up. He didn't want to make a mistake, and he believed as a general, it was especially important for him to have a clear mind. Just as he cleared his mind, a knock came at the door. Anakin opened his eyes and let out a begrudgingly heavy sigh, and told whoever it was to come in as he turned his head to see Natabre. He laughed a little, and he thought it was Ahsoka. Natabre looked down at him on the mat, and her eyebrows shot into her hairline. She let a quick oops and told him that she didn't mean to interrupt him. She started back out of the room, and he told her it was fine, she could stay. Natabre nodded her head and slid into the room as the door behind her closed. She asked if he was taking up her advice on a meditation, and he with a smirk told her that he was trying to, until she decided to knock on his door. Obviously the tone was sarcastic, so there's no hostility or animosity between them. He asked her about what was the matter, and she said nothing. She just wanted to see if he wanted to meditate together before they got to the planet Luwak. He said it was weird that they were both thinking the same things, and she shoved his shoulder as she walked by, thanking him for inviting her in. Anakin threw his arms up and told her that he didn't know what she was doing. She mocked him by mimicking the mouth movement with a roll of her eyes. Anakin straightened his face with a sarcastic grin, and asked if he could be so honored to have her accompany him through another meditation. She repeated the word honored back to him in a playful way, and nodded her head as she got down on the opposite side of the mat and looked at him. She told him to lead on, and he shook his head, repeating no more than once and insisting that she lead this meditation. Natabre again rolled her eyes and laid her hands out on her legs and straightened her posture, and took a deep breath. The two of them reached out their hands and laid them in each other's, Anakin's right hand in her left, and her left hand in his right hand. They had done this exercise a number of times on Octoon. They were super close, and the trust to share this type of moment with each other was imperative for their relationship as co-generals or co-leaders. This would help them firm the relationship with the other student. Natabre and Anakin focused on their connection to each other. The two of them were transported into the Force itself, using their bond with the other to face the Force in a sense of direction. They both could feel and see everything the other was feeling. Natabre was able to see something that had been unmentioned or dragging on him, or maybe he did mention it, but it wasn't something that she could really conceptualize in the moment. It was a woman, but Natabre knew her. Anakin seemingly wasn't able to remove this memory or this pain from his heart. Despite him not talking about it or mentioning it to anyone, it sat within him. He was able to obtain some type of closure with the death of Obi-Wan, a lot of that in part due to Satine and her kind words. Natabre recognized the Senator, and the frolicking in the fields of Naboo. At the end of it all, there was Anakin with the Senator, promising her that they'd be married when the conflict was all over. A conflict that since hadn't come to an end yet. On the other hand, Anakin was watching someone who held themselves to such a high standard delve into the darkness the way he would have when she was a youngling. Natabre was almost kicked from the Jedi Order when she was 7 years old. It was before Anakin was ever brought to the Order, and she had a massive spurt of power in the Force, accompanied by a growth in the darkness. Natabre didn't know what she was doing, but knowing how critical the Jedi Council could be, she was almost forced in the Order. The only saving grace was how apologetic she was for it. She narrowly survived the will of the Council, being allowed to stay in the Order thanks to one vote. Obviously, had Anakin been a member of the Order, she likely would have been removed from the Jedi Order itself. Skywalker could see her latch onto that darkness subconsciously and allow it to control her every move going forward. It wasn't that she used it, but she allowed the fear of darkness manipulate her heart and throw her through constant turmoil. She felt like no matter where she was under a constant microscope, and no matter how much she cared for her master, that pressure built over the years. The first time she felt a sense of freedom from it all is when they went to Tython, but it still sat within her, an untouched trauma. As they continued learning about each other through their journey, through the Force and meditation, Skywalker's memories provided one last tidbit of inspiration or information which pertained to something said by Obi-Wan. Though the weirdest thing about this little quote is that it felt like it was being said for the first time. As they both heard, there are alternatives to fighting. The two of them fell out of the meditation. Despite the meditation bringing up memories for the two of them, it caused their bond to only flourish. They felt a sense of peace at the same time, knowing that someone else knew everything about them. Natabre now knew that Anakin was invested in some sort of relationship before the fall of the Republic, and Anakin now knew that Natabre was not so different from him. The secrets of the past are often quite revealing about those one cares about. When they came from the vision, they didn't remove their hands from the other's grip. Truthfully, they held onto the other with a little more firmness. They looked at each other and they started to speak to each other. The tension of their hands loosening, but their hold of the other not. They still held on and they continued talking, getting to know the other and understand the mysteries of each other's lives that had not been shared. While one could assume they would know, not everyone knows everything about someone they've known for only a couple months, no matter how close they might be. This was something that several meditations hadn't revealed thus far, and at least in Natabre's mind, she believed that these pieces of information were incredibly important for whatever came next in their lives and in this war. Anakin agreed, though he was most concerned about the quote from his former master, the one about alternatives to fighting. Neither of them could come up with an answer, and so perhaps the message was from a past era. That was entirely possible, but Anakin suggested that if these Jedi teachings were indeed correct about the Force always being in motion, maybe it was a lesson for the future. Natabre agreed, but they stayed in the room for a couple more hours, simply talking. When it was clear they were approaching the target, Anakin and Natabre got themselves ready. They were going to capture the Star Forge, and the war would be theirs. A very simple transaction. Anakin and Natabre told their students to be ready in the hangar bays. They'd be in the bridge preparing to get an idea of where the weapon was and go after it. The two of them got up next to Admiral Coburn as they watched the fleet arrive out of hyperspace. The support ships got there first, before they were followed by the ships of the line. Admiral Coburn turned to the deckhands and told them to open up scanners for any potential objects orbiting the system. The deckhands responded saying they weren't picking up on anything. Anakin looked at Natabre and asked her if they should let the Padawans lead a group of V-19s out and see if they could find the object. Natabre looked at Anakin and then at Admiral Coburn, who shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps it wouldn't be a terrible idea. They could get some experience in the field without an active battle going on. Admiral Coburn called down to the hangar bay and informed Commanders Tano and Ithaca that they'd be going and leading Squadrons 4 and 7 into the field to search for the Star Forge. If they could find it, then they could direct the fleet into the right direction. The two Padawans looked to each other, and they were both giggling about something, and then their faces turned white. One of the clone pilots told them that they would be fine. They had the clones to back them up. Ahsoka smiled and told Zala they would be alright. Zala nodded her head. She knew the day would come, but she was dreading it more than ever before. Of course, every day up until this day, she feared being a commander, but they always had Natabre or Anakin or Ahsoka or Cody that could go first. Of course, they would throw her into a leading position after Thyphera. Zala knew that no one was here. She was just nervous. She got out of her head and made her way to her ship and jumped in. The two Padawans lifted up and flew out of the hangar bays as their squadrons lined up behind them. Admiral Coburn told them to fan out. One of them could take the ground expedition, and the other could investigate the far side of the planet. They acknowledged and moved out. Natabre and Anakin watched with pride as their students moved out into the space around Lowek. Natabre asked Anakin if he believed they would find the weapon here, and he turned and suggested that he believed they would. It wasn't unreasonable to assume that they would. At the very least, they'd be a step closer than the Sith Empire, so that's all that really mattered, as long as the Sith didn't get to the weapon first. An hour would pass by, and Admiral Coburn would bring a request for the squadrons to return to base. There was no sign of this magnificent space station. Perhaps the artifacts had it all wrong. A deckhand called out the Admiral's name and told him that there were a number of objects coming out of hyperspace. He asked if they were allies or not. The deckhand didn't know. He was unsure. The frequency wasn't normal. The Admiral asked if it was space whales, and then the fleet dropped out of hyperspace. Coburn turned to the crew and told them to raise the shields. He then requested that the two squadrons get back to the fleet. Natabre told Anakin to come with her. He told her he'd be right there. Coburn told the Padawans that General Mordin would be taking over the battle. There was no need to worry. Turns out there was a need to worry. Zala, who was in control of the squadron in space, was caught off guard. Her squadron was right next to the flagship of the Sith Lord, who was in control of the operation. Anakin was analyzing the fleet. While he wasn't super into reading in the sort, he liked to have an idea of what he was going up against. He counted the ships and looked at the flagship. He told the Admiral that was one of the older Sith. Anakin then turned and ran out of the room. Coburn kind of threw his hands up. What good did that knowledge do him? As Anakin was making it to the hangar bay, Natabre told Skywalker from the air that Zala's squadron had been ripped apart and her ship was caught in a tractor beam at the back of their fleet. She didn't engage. She tried to reroute the troops as she was ordered, but that didn't work quite as well as the Admiral believed it would. While Natabre was bringing her squad around to counter the Sith, Ahsoka and her squad were able to group up behind her. The battle was finally getting started, and one of the Jedi was already missing. Skywalker flew his yellow starfighter out of the hangar bay, and spun it through a number of incoming missiles as he looked for the command ship. This particular Sith did it weird. His command ship was hidden on the far right of the flank, which wasn't too common for a Sith to do. They didn't like to risk themselves, but this particular Sith clearly didn't subscribe to that strategy. Skywalker told Natabre that he could make a beeline for the flagship. She wanted to argue because it was her Padawan, but he didn't have a squad behind him. He was the last to exit the hangar bay. She told him that she could provide cover fire. Before she could provide that cover, Ahsoka told her that she would do it. Ahsoka's squadron rolled over and followed Anakin as he blasted by, avoiding wings of fighters trying to cut him off. His resilience in the heat of battle was something to be admired, as he spun the ship through a hole in one of the flagships, which helped him avoid the fighters behind him. As Anakin pulled through, he saw the hangar bay, and the ship was clipped by a turbo laser. The blast almost obliterated his ship, but he was able to guide the vessel into the hangar bay where it slammed down, rocking him with a whiplash force. Anakin held onto the cockpit as the ship slid across the ground. He radioed out and told them that he would need an LAAT pickup whenever they had a chance. He was stuck. Anakin popped R2 out of the vessel and unlatched himself, kicking the broken cockpit window out as he climbed from the ship. He turned around. The hangar bay was lined with soldiers. Anakin radioed in and told them that if they came, make sure they were prepared for the amount of troopers in the hangar bay. Anakin stepped forward with a bit of cockiness in his step. His adversary was holding the Padawan Zala by the back of her neck. It wasn't too forceful, but just enough that Anakin could see it. He grabbed his lightsaber and the man stepped out from behind the Padawan and waved his fingers. He told Skywalker that he'd been waiting for this encounter for a long time. Anakin looked to his sides and then back to the man, asking, "Who are you?" Skywalker's peculiar grin only aggravated Exar Kun. He told Anakin to stop where he was, so Anakin did, throwing his hands up into the air, kinda smiling. He asked what the Sith wanted, and this only continued to offend the Sith Lord. He told him that he was Lord Exar Kun, the leader of the Sith Empire. Anakin looked at the troops surrounding him. Whether it was a Sith acolyte or a grunt trooper, they didn't seem too interested in his little spiel. Anakin turned back towards Exar with a grin on his face, and the Sith Lord told Anakin that he wanted to gut him with his own blade. Skywalker, despite his recent loss, was feeling all the more arrogant. Not in a bad way, but in a hyped up way. Exar just hyped him up by telling him he was actively hunting him for the entire war, or at least since Tython. How adorable. Exar ignited his lightsaber and raised it above his head. Anakin quickly pulled Zala with the Force and caught her. She looked at him with shock on her face, but he turned her back and set her down, telling her to stay with R2. Zala slowly moved over to the droid as Skywalker ignited his lightsaber. Outside the ship, the fleet battle was intensifying. The Republic was outnumbered significantly, but Admiral Coburn and Natabre were working closely in tandem as they were communicating fluently with each other. Their efficiency allowed them to divide and conquer pieces of the Sith fleet. though a number of Republic support ships were starting to crumble. Due to Coburn's desire to save the fleet for as long as he could, not knowing when they would be able to get reinforcements, he moved support ships to the edge of their firing range. This left the fleet in a subtle disadvantage, but he was willing to do it to protect his sailors. Anakin and Exar slammed their blades together. Exar was genuinely impressed with the strength that Skywalker was able to distribute through one swing. But the Sith Lord had one advantage: experience. He knew a lot more than a 19-year-old Anakin did, and he would take advantage of that. They were spinning their blades slowly, nothing too quick, just a means to get a feel for the other. Anakin turned Exar around so he could keep an eye on Zala. As his back faced the Sith, Anakin kept remembering the alternatives fighting message, but it wasn't sticking in his mind. Where could he use it? They looked at each other and stammered back as Anakin blasted Exar backwards. The strike genuinely surprised the Sith Lord, and it aggravated a sense of anger within him. Exar launched himself back at Skywalker and their blades toyed with each other, matching strike for strike, not avoiding what could become of a deadly encounter for either of them. Anakin was fighting up, just due to the skill set Exar had. The fighting only continued to intensify, as Anakin batted every attempt away from him until a strike from the Sith Lord cut upwards across Anakin's face and he fell to the ground holding his hand over his eye. Did he lose his sight? Anakin couldn't tell. Behind the cupped hand, he couldn't tell if he was blind or if it was just the darkness. Skywalker used one eye to look over at Exar, who stood over him. Anakin scooted away, trying to find his lightsaber as he pulled away his hand from his eye to see what felt like a blinding whiteness. Though every time he blinked, he could see more and more of the surroundings form in front of his eyes. He wasn't blind, he was just temporarily blind from the extreme light that radiated off the blade. He put his hand over his eye and felt the cut's heat, and he pulled his hand back. Skywalker looked up at Exar, who raised his hand over his head to strike down Anakin. As he prepared to lower his weapon, another lightsaber ignited. Exar turned around, picking the Padawan off the ground by grabbing a hold of her Jedi tunic. Anakin yelled out and used the Force to launch Exar. His lightsaber dropped to the ground, and he slammed into the side of the hangar bay. Zala fell to the ground, and she looked over at Anakin. He nodded to her, grabbing his lightsaber and igniting, stammering back to where Zala was. All the Sith warriors refused to move. They just watched. Anakin told R2 and Zala to get behind him. Rescue was coming, hopefully. She needed to be the first one on the ship, though. She nodded her head and backed off with the droid behind her. Exar rose from the side of the hangar bay as he shook his shoulders, as if he were preparing to square up. Anakin could feel the radiant darkness coming off of him. He thought of alternatives to fighting, but he wasn't seeing anything in the moment. Exar ran forward and shot lightning from both of his hands as Anakin blocked it with all of his strength, and then watched the Sith Lord launch into the air and drag his blade into his hands with the Force and ignite it, slamming down against Anakin's. The combo was very deadly, and Skywalker barely held his own. Outside the hangar bay, it was clear the Republic was being pushed from the wreck, and Natabre was adamant on recovering Skywalker and her Padawan. Coburn was not thrilled with it, but he understood the desire. Thanks to Exar's decision to put his flagship on the edge of the flank, he could take advantage of it, so he did. The fleet moved forward and broadsided the hell out of Exar's flagship. Inside the hangar, Anakin and Zala shook, but they held on. Skywalker was able to throw his blade against Exar, but the Sith Lord used an old cheat code that most Sith and Jedi pretty much agreed was illegal. He extinguished and then ignited his lightsaber, dropping the blade and swinging up. It was extremely lucky that Anakin mistimed his strike, because if he hadn't, he would need another hand. The hangar was then filled with a firepower from every direction. 3 LA-ATs entered, with 2 Jedi starfighters speeding through and laying waste to the Sith lines. The LA-ATs came in and started firing away as the bay doors opened and suppressing fire was laid upon the Sith. Cody, Waxer, Boyle, and Lucky hopped out of the gunship and grabbed Zala's arm and brought her back into the ship. R2 got himself up into the ship, and Cody called out to Skywalker and told him he was clear. He told the gunships to go. They started lifting up, and the first 2 began to bail. Exar charged Anakin, and they met again, spinning, swinging, and digging at each other. Anakin spun back and launched Exar with the Force. He used his strength to block it, though the power still slid him across the bay floors. The Sith troopers tried to return fire, but it was far too late. Anakin extinguished his lightsaber, turned, and 2-finger saluted the Sith Lord, telling him he'd see him at the finish line. He leapt up into the ship and the doors closed as it sped out of the hangar bay into space. The Republic was able to get most of its forces back into the vessels and retreat. Despite the Republic losing the battle, they only lost a number of starfighters and 2 support ships. Coburn's strategy melded really well with the timid Sith fleet, which is what allowed them to conserve their forces before they made the jump to hyperspace. When Zala got out of her LA-AT, she reunited with her master and was in a bundle of tears. She was very skittish to lead, but there was something else going on. Anakin could feel it, but Natabre took her Padawan and took her somewhere private so she could talk with her alone. Commander Cody came up to Anakin before he could say anything to Ahsoka, telling him that he was needed on the bridge. Anakin nodded his head and turned over to Ahsoka and told her to come with. As she did, He told her that she did well, and he was very proud of her. Ahsoka thanked him, but she admitted that if it wasn't for Master Morden, she wouldn't have known what to do. Anakin smiled and told her, while patting her shoulder, that the time would come when she would be proud of herself for her own accomplishments. She did well, with the assistance of the general. When they entered the bridge of the vessel, Admiral Coburn was looking at a clone trooper with scuffed up armor. Shells were landing around him. The commands were all as simple as it could get. Retreat. The troops were moving quickly, and Rex picked up Master Windu, who was apparently knocked out by a blast that exploded right next to him after engaging with another Sith Lord. Rex, using his communication device while carrying Windu, told the Jedi General that the Sith knew. They were coming. They were out here, and they were ready to fight. Anakin turned to Coburn, who told them they were on Cordia, just a couple systems away. Anakin put his hand to his face, similar to the fashion of what his master would have done. He told Rex to get out of there as soon as they could. They needed to regroup. Admiral Coburn told Rex that they'd be going to Zaja. If they could regroup there, then perhaps there was a chance of getting to the Starforge and holding it down. Anakin continued to look at the communication until the transmission ended. Commander Cody asked his Jedi General what it was. Anakin turned to him and Ahsoka, who were flanking his left side. He told them that perhaps the key to winning this war, or even finding the Starforge, required an alternative means to fighting. And that, my friends, is our episode. Again, special thanks to Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir Willem 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Cullen Rooney, The Last Jedi, Apollo Wiwu 670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny Naguin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Geek Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, the main three first names, Dark Saint 46, Aaron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Smash that like button if you support me in other ways. Go check out the Patreon. Otherwise, I hope you're all enjoying so far. It is heating up. Season finale is coming out in a couple weeks. I'll see you guys at the finish line. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.